them that the worst part, the best part. This is the best of the rest.
Hello, and the sun is shining.
But the ice is slippery.
This is Best of the Rest, the show where we take a second look at comic book movies that were poorly received upon release, but only talk about the things we liked and what the movie does well. It's sometimes a challenge, but always a good time. And this week, we are talking The Shadow. My name is Chris Logan, and I am joined, as always, by the man with the power to fog your mind with comic book knowledge, Andrew Williams. You ready for this one, Andrew?
I am ready for The Shadow.
Yes. Have you seen this movie before prepping for this episode?
I don't think so, actually. I feel like this was one of those movies that, like, I mean, it came out in 94, so I was 7. So I didn't catch it on release. And my dad doesn't like Alec Baldwin very much. So probably didn't see it for that reason. But yeah, just kind of went by me as a kid. And then growing up, just never really made time for it. The word of mouth was always that it was kind of a mess. So just never really came back around to it. But until now.
Yeah, I had definitely never watched it. Honestly, I had never heard of this movie for a large part of my life. It wasn't until well into adulthood where I found out there was this weird pulp adaptation in the 90s and Alec Baldwin was a superhero. And that just sounds bizarre because by that time, Alec Baldwin, his current career is more in comedy and he's known for a lot of different things. I wasn't a movie watcher in the era where he was like leading man. So it's very strange to look back and think of him as a superhero.
Hey, you think of him in like Beetlejuice or something, which is kind of leading man and kind of funny. But then like he had a couple of weird, like straight action roles, like Hunt for the Red October and this. And it's just never really seeing him now on like 30 Rock. It just doesn't, there's just a dissonance there that doesn't work.
We've talked a lot on this show about how in the 90s, following the success of Batman, Hollywood sort of took the lesson that pulp adaptations were what was in because Batman was from the 30s. And we got movies like The Rocketeer or The Phantom, which we've talked about. And also The Shadow, who is a very, very old character from like pulp comics, not even like modern comic books like we know, went from like comic strips and even a radio show. That's how old this character is. So definitely not at the forefront of most people's minds these days and not in the 90s either.
No, I mean, he debuts on radio first, I think. Has his radio debut and then shows up in print, I think, the next year. And this is, I think it's 1930 that he's on the radio, and that's 8 years before Superman. So, I mean, we're talking dawn of the superhero or the dawn of the vigilante type thing here.
Well, Andrew, we're going to dive into it. We're going to talk about what works in this movie. You talked about it earlier. The reception isn't too hot. The word of mouth, not too great, but we watched it and we're going to bring you all of the positives of this movie and what they do right. Because that's what we do on the show. #positivity podcast. Before we jump into that, I just want to remind everybody that we do now have a Discord. Come and join us. There's a link in the episode description. If you've never used Discord before, it's simply a place for communities to get together, hang out and chat. So jump in there, talk about this episode, talk about this podcast, or whatever else you want. Chat with us about movies. We tell you every episode that if there's a comic book movie that you like that was poorly received upon release, we want to know about it. Who's your favorite performance? What's the best scene in the movie? You can, of course, send us an email, bestoftheRestPod@gmail.com. Or just jump into that Discord and put it right there. And whenever we cover that movie, we will read your message on the episode. The Shadow was released July 1st, 1994 on a budget of $40 million. Pretty modest budget these days, but that's about what Batman 89 was made for. At the box office, it does not make as much money as Batman 89. It makes $48 million, barely clearing that budget, definitely losing money for the studio, and critically not received well at all, just a 35% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah, didn't make a lot of waves, didn't really leave much of a positive impact. I'm not sure if it was just the fact it was a movie about the Shadow, or if it was just like I said, it just didn't seem to catch on at the time, and doesn't really feel like there's been any kind of late stage resurgence about it. Like this
Yeah,
doesn't feel like it's one where
I don't think this is a cult movie. I don't think
right.
there's there's
It's
fans out there for sure,
sure,
but I don't think
absolutely.
it's
But
sort of been rediscovered, like you said.
yeah, I don't think there's any articles coming out. You know what deserves a second look? The Shadow. But but hey, I might disagree with some of that.
Yeah, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but the bar was low as far as expectations are concerned. I knew I was going in looking for the positives, and I knew I'd find something, but I was pleasantly surprised. A lot of cool stuff in this movie and a lot of talent involved. The movie was written by David Koepp, who also was a co-writer on Death Becomes Her, which is a very fun movie from the 90s. And another movie from the 90s you probably heard of called Jurassic Park. He would go on to have credits on movies like Mission Impossible and Spider-Man. And he is the writer and director of Premium Rush, which we've talked about before, but is a nice, fun little action movie starring the greatest actor of our time, Michael Shannon. It's very, very good.
Yeah, there was a period of time there where it felt like if there was a high profile thing, David Koepp was coming in to write it. We're looking, like you said, Jurassic Park, the Mission Impossibles, Indiana Jones 4. I know that movie's got its legacy, but it's still a very high profile gig. And even stuff later, smaller stuff, and like I said, Premium Rush, which is a great movie. I just bought it. Need to go back and sit down and rewatch it.
The Shadow was directed by Russell Mulcahy, who also directed Highlander and overall has a very, very strange filmography.
Yes.
Obviously, directed Highlander. He's been around for a long time, since the 80s, but there's very large gaps in his filmography where I could not find out what this man was doing for work. It then shows up later with something like he directed Resident Evil Extinction, which I don't know which one that is, 3 or 4, but it's randomly in the middle of the Resident Evil franchise. Russell Mulcahy comes in and directs that. So Highlander, The Shadow, Resident Evil Extinction. It's not even like those are bad gigs or roles. They're just so far spread out. They're just I don't know what this guy's doing for work.
Yeah, he's a guy that did an immense amount of music videos as well in the early 80s, like before Highlander. He did a bunch for Elton John, The Tubes, Spandau Ballet, Duran Duran. Like he was all over the place directing music videos in the early 80s. And like I said, he jumps to films and it's pretty regular until kind of the late 90s. And then it gets very sporadic, like very few and far between. Maybe by that point he'd made his money and was kind of just, living in Jamaica, who knows? But
hey man, I can't blame him.
But when that call comes for Resident Evil 3, you got to take it.
Yeah, 3, is that which one it is? I thought they were all by Paul W.S.
Anderson. Yeah, I think he does he does the bulk of them. I think he's married to Mila Jovovich, so why not get the guy who did Highlander to do Resident Evil?
Why not? Well, let's jump into this movie, Andrew. Early in the 20th century, Lamont Cranston, a New Yorker living in Tibet as a drug lord, is captured and taken to a mysterious and hidden temple. There, he meets the Tulku, a holy man with extraordinary powers who offers Lamont a chance at redemption by bestowing upon him the power to cloud people's minds and render himself invisible. Lamont returns to New York with a mission to fight evil as the Shadow. After falling for a beautiful telepathic woman named Margot Lane, another one of the Tulku students named Shawan Khan arrives in New York City with the intention of taking over the world. After Khan captures Margot's scientist father to create an atomic bomb, the Shadow, Margot, and a network of allies must work together to stop the evil Khan. What a synopsis. I was putting that together and, I just kind of casually said that the girl he falls in love with is telepathic. And yeah, it's kind of just casually thrown into the movie too. It's very strange.
It is. It's a wild story when you really think about it. And especially when the runtime is only like 108 minutes. So we're looking at like 100 minutes of actual screen time. So there's a lot going on in this movie. It really doesn't slow down the entire runtime.
It does not. What we're going to do now is jump into the cast of this movie, talk about the performances. And of course, as always, we're going to start at the high point with the best casting, the best performance in the movie. We like to recognize one actor or actress that goes so far above and beyond the call of duty that they raise the quality of the entire film with their performance, and we award that person the Mark Strong Award. Andrew, who gets your Mark Strong Award for The Shadow?
I think I just have to go straight up. I think it's Alec Baldwin as Lamont Cranston / The Shadow.
100%. I totally agree, and not to tarnish the Mark Strong Award or backhand this, but it's not that he excels so much as the Shadow. Like, oh man, you got to watch the movie for this performance. It's that he anchors the movie well. He's solid. Right. If it was miscast in the lead, a lot of this movie would fall apart, and I think it mostly works. And he's got, we mentioned 100 minutes of screen time. He's in most of it. I mean, he's carrying this movie, and he does a great job.
Yeah, I think he gets a good balance to being the wealthy playboy and then kind of shifting into the Shadow. Gets an odd prosthetic nose as the Shadow that just makes him look like his brother.
So many hero shots. It's him as the Shadow and unrecognizable as Alec Baldwin. And I don't exactly know why. That's not a traditional thing with the Shadow, where he looks different. It's sort of, they were making a nod to like some of the original pulp comics, because he has like this really long nose and big chin, even though he's wearing a bandana over the bottom half of his face, and you usually don't see it. And it kind of makes him look like the pulp version. So it's kind of just a nod to that. But his whole thing is he makes himself invisible to people. So it's weird that on top of that, he is also disguising
his face. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, he gets some, like I said, he anchors the whole movie. So he's given a lot more than most of the other casts to really work with, but he does a good job with it. Like I said, you buy him as Lamont Cranston, as the Shadow. He's, like I said, he's mostly covered. It might not even be him most of the time. But he does a great job here. He stands above, like you said, he holds the whole thing together, and he's got that charisma, he's got the charm, and it all comes and works here.
We talked about some of his movies already. This is definitely the era of his career where he was a leading man for Red October, like you mentioned, has a notable role in Glengarry Glen Ross. And so movies like that, or this movie, Hunt for Red October, he's meant to be taken seriously. But here's the thing about Alec Baldwin. He does mostly known for comedies now, particularly like 30 Rock is where a lot of people know him from. And he's doing the exact same thing, but it's just in a comedic setting. So 30 Rock, again, great example, because he's like, a executive and in charge, just like a lot of those roles I just mentioned, but it comes off as funny, even though he's got this voice where it almost sounds like he's always doing a voice, but that's just his voice. He just has this breathy voice. And it's again, here supposed to be taken seriously. The exact same thing later in his career is played for comedy. Even something like, Boss Baby, obviously, it's doing that voice for comedy. It's very, very interesting, and probably a good thing that he can maybe have a sense of humor about himself and make that switch and extend his career in that way.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that he, like I said, I don't know what the split is. I don't really know if there's an internal switch between when he's playing it for laughs and when he's not, but he really is kind of always doing the same thing. Even now, when you look at like 30 Rock versus like Mission Impossible, those performances aren't that far apart. Like he's really not that split on them, even though the genres are completely different.
It reminds me of like Leslie Nielsen when he was asked how he was able to flip his career into comedy and be successful. And he's like, I just played it deadly straight. I just did what I always did, but given the material, it comes off as funny, and he just rolled with it. And obviously, even a more extreme example in that case, made his career.
Oh yeah. I mean, the 80s comedic resurgence of Leslie Nielsen is arguably what takes him from notable actor in the 50s, 60s and like cements it. Like the comedy is what he comes known for, even though he has this long career before that.
R.I.P. Leslie Nielsen.
Yes.
John Lone plays our villain, Shawan Khan.
John Lone, notably known to probably more people as the villain of Rush Hour 2. The Chris Tucker, Jackie Chan vehicle. Also featured in War, which was the Jet Li, Jason Statham film that came out back in 2007, I think. But before
Jet
that,
Li and Jason Statham, because they were in The One together, right? And that's the two of them. Jet Li.
No,
and
I don't
Jason
think so. I don't think Statham's in that.
That's not Jason Statham?
I don't think so.
I'm Googling this right now.
I am too, because I don't trust you. The one is with no one you've. Oh, it is Statham. They did 2
Hey,
movies together. Wow.
that's the one I know. I'm not familiar with the war.
Huh.
Anyway, fun fact. I've got nothing else to say about it. Let's move on.
But yeah, he's he's got the villain role here, playing the last of Genghis Khan's descendants, who also seems to have powers similar to the Shadow. So he's able to manipulate the whole town into literally not seeing a whole building. It's pretty cool. But he's basically out to destroy the world.
Yeah, have a good time doing it. He's always laughing or clearly reveling in the evil that he does. At one point, he makes a taxi driver just drive into a gas truck and kill himself with his powers. And again, laughs while he does it, having a good time. What a bad guy.
Yeah, he's hamming it up, chewing the scenery, and he makes a really good foil for Alec Baldwin's The Shadow.
Penelope Ann Miller plays Margot Lane, the telepathic love interest that we spoke on earlier. And I really like this performance. She's kind of dressed like the movie takes place in the 30s, so maybe flapper is not the right word to use, but like a socialite of the time, always wearing fancy dresses, got the nice haircut, and it never is reduced to kind of that damsel in distress role, which can sometimes happen with love interest. She's always holding her own, always challenging the Shadow. Because she's telepathic, a lot of his influence simply does not work on her, and he's always scared that she's going to find out his true nature, his secret identity. A fun foil. Even gets to save the hero, save his life at one point in the movie.
Yeah, she's not a damsel in distress in the classic sense of the term. She gets some stuff to work with here. So like I said, she's got her own powers, she's got her own stuff going on, and she's doing a good job. Has good chemistry with Baldwin. Obviously, she's done a few notable things before this and after this. She was in, Carlito's Way, The Shadow. She was in The Artist more recently, and is just a good, solid actress. I'm glad to see that she, obviously this was a big part and was meant to be kind of a big deal. Didn't end up panning out that way, but she does a great job with it.
Now, I'm watching this movie, like I said, for the first time, and the opening credits are pretty cool. It's just a slow reveal of the Shadow logo, and that's where you see names like Alec Baldwin and Penelope Ann Miller. And then the movie starts, and the opening credits continue, and I start to see names like Peter Boyle. I'm like, oh, I know Peter Boyle. Ian McKellen. I'm like, wow, Ian McKellen's in this. Tim Curry's name comes up. I'm like, holy crap, there's a lot of like
who all is in this
profile.
movie.
Exactly. And I don't know the star status of all of those names in 1994. They certainly probably continue to grow after that. But regardless, a pretty as someone I know would say, a pretty stacked cast, you could say. Peter Boyle. I know him mostly because of Everybody Loves Raymond. He plays Raymond's dad there. He's also notably in Monsters Ball, where again he plays the dad. Just a real not good guy in that movie. Quite a different turn than his role as Raymond's dad on Everybody Loves Raymond. But a great performance nonetheless. R.A.P. Peter Boyle, no longer with us, but I always enjoyed anytime he was on my screen.
Oh yeah, obviously the one I actually think I know him most for is he plays the monster in Young Frankenstein, and he's so funny in that role. There's so much physical comedy playing off of Gene Wilder. He's so good, and like you said, obviously later audiences came to know him for Everybody Loves Raymond, but even before that, he'd had a huge, massive career. I remember him notably from The Santa Claus, where he plays Tim Allen's boss, who kind of tells him to get some help, where he's like, something's up, dude, get some help. So like I said, tons of appearances, a smorgasbord of a career of all different genres. And yeah, he's not given a whole lot to do here. He basically plays the Shadow's driver, essentially, who's this cab driver. Mo Shrevnitz. And yeah, he basically is one of the people that's in the Shadow's network. That's kind of what he does, is he basically, after he saves someone, they're brought into his network, and that's kind of how he keeps his ear to the ground on what's happening in the city. And in his spare time, apparently, Mo still drives his cab, kind of badly, seemingly. There's a scene where he's driving this couple around like wildly, And you think it's because the shadow has called him and he's trying to get them out of his car, but then you realize the shadow calls him like during this. So I'm like, no, that's just how he drives, apparently.
Yeah, he gets the call, and so he pulls over. He's like, all right, y'all got to get out. And they just say, thank you, and then get out of his cab, and then he goes and picks up the shadow.
Yeah.
It's funny, these actors I just named, because, seeing Peter Boyle or Ian McKellen, Tim Curry, I see him in the movie. I'm like, oh, this is like a young Peter Boyle. This is a young Ian McKellen, but not really. Peter Boyle was 59 when he made this movie. Ian McKellen was 55. I'm just used to seeing a much older Ian McKellen. It actually took me a while. I knew he was in the movie on his opening credits, and then I'm like halfway through the movie. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. This character is Ian McKellen, because he looks different. He's got shorter hair. It's still gray, but he's wearing glasses. It's just not the Gandalf or Magneto Ian McKellen that I'm used to. But he has a fun role as Dr. Reinhardt Lane, actually Margot Lane's father, who is a scientist and plays a key role in the plot. He is notably colorblind. It's kind of a running gag throughout the movie.
Yeah,
using his green and red. The great chemistry with Penelope Ann Miller as his daughter, and it was a good time. I like it.
Yeah, it's fun. He, like I said, this is another one. It's weird seeing all of these people in what amount to kind of bit parts when you're used to them being kind of much more prominently featured, especially in McKellen's case. So yeah, he's back a little bit, but it's he's working well here. He's, like I said, he does the absent-minded professor thing pretty well. He actually kind of looks older to me here than he does in something like X-Men, even though that's 6 years later. Because I guess it's just a different type of role. Yeah, the glasses, the look. If he had the nice pressed Magneto suit here, he probably would have looked a lot younger. But
he's wearing like a Mr. Rogers sweater.
Yeah, it's like a really haphazard looking guy. But yeah, he's doing a good job here, and he's having fun with it.
And like I said, Tim Curry's in this movie as a character named Farley Claymore. And honestly, I don't know, like 4 scenes. He's not in the movie a ton. He's kind of like an assistant to Ian McKellen's character, who ends up betraying him because Ian McKellen, as Dr. Reinhardt Lane, does not want to help our villain create the bomb, which is his ultimate plan. But Tim Curry's character is quick to switch sides and do the villain's bidding.
Yeah, I think he works for the government, maybe, or he works for like the War Department, which it was called at the time. So he's basically he's the liaison to the government between Ian McKellen and the higher ups. But yeah, he doesn't even think about like selling everybody out. Like he's like, the guy's like, I'd like to talk to you. I'm in. Like it's that kind of quick for him. So
and as he as he breaks bad, if you will, throughout the movie, he sort of becomes more and more Tim Curry, because he's very straightforward in the beginning. He just sounds like a normal guy. Yeah. But as he gets evil, he gets those Tim Curry isms, and he gets that like extra syllables between words. Those things that Tim Curry throws into his dialogue just comes out more and more throughout the movie.
You're not wrong. That's what makes it so funny. Like he just like, it's like he acts with his whole body, including his dialogue.
My Tim Curry impressions is no words. It's just.
Even thinking about stuff like Home Alone 2, like you're just thinking of, now I can't watch him without realizing the unnecessary syllables.
Yeah. Oh, they're necessary. They're what makes you remember them.
Yeah, that's true.
Jonathan Winters plays Wainwright Barth.
Jonathan Winters is like a legendary comedic actor from, the 40s, 50s, 60s, like the dawn of television. Like he's been everywhere. He made later appearances in the 80s and 90s television shows, but like he was like a featured actor on all sorts of shows from back in the day, the Steve Allen Show, the Gary Moore Show, had his own shows, just like was everywhere for a time. Like if you go to your parents or maybe your grandparents, they'll absolutely know who Jonathan Winters is. He was that kind of person in like that golden age of television. And so here he's playing, again, oddly, a completely straight performance, which has nothing to do with comedy whatsoever. He gets a couple of kind of funny moments, but it's not really because of what he's doing. It's more the circumstance. But he plays what I believe is the Shadow's uncle, who's the commissioner of the police, who he mentions a few times. But there's a particularly funny scene where the Shadow is using his powers on him, and Jonathan Winter's like, "That's it, I've had it. I'm going to open up a task force to apprehend the Shadow." And the Shadow's like, "You're not going to do that." And he's like, "You know what? I'm not going to do that." Like, it's just like
he reminds me a lot of Commissioner Gordon from the Batman franchise in the 90s, because he's a police commissioner, and he's a large man. He's a rotund man. He looks a lot like Commissioner Gordon from those movies.
He does.
And he's not like bumbling or useless, but he's kind of useless. He's usually not the one,
he's not really doing anything. And again, it's kind of weird, but as he got into like the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, he definitely did smaller things just because, I mean, why not? Kind of like Ed Asner worked pretty much until he died. I think the last thing Jonathan Winters probably notably did is, if you saw those recent CGI Smurfs movies, I believe he was the voice of Papa Smurf. So playing the big roles all the way to the end.
R.I.P. Jonathan Winters.
Yes.
Saab Shimono plays Dr. Roy Tam. Not in the movie a ton, but a significant role. Plays some key to the plot of this movie. Not much to say about it. Does a good job. He's playing a doctor.
Yeah, he's the person we see at the beginning of the film. He's rescued by the Shadow, and he's the guy we actually kind of see inducted into the Shadow's organization. So it's a small part, but it's kind of cool to see that process kind of play out, because the rest of it really is just kind of like, this already exists. And I kind of like that about the movie too, that like the Shadow and his giant network and his pneumatic tubes all over the city are already a thing. So we get to see this kind of this induction into that process for his character, and I just think that's cool. Obviously, Saab Shimono being recurring on the show after his trailblazing role in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 as Lord Noranaga. But
yes, it's Don King.
Son of a...
Everybody comes back again on this show, Andrew.
Everybody,
including the great Frank Welker. He does a voice in this movie. You know what he voices, Andrew? Phurba, the sentient dagger.
That I don't believe ever speaks words.
Oh, no. It's very much just...
It's just a higher pitched Tim Curry, apparently.
Yeah, there you go. The character of Phurba reminds me of another 90s movie, which also featured a sentient dagger. It was just a thing in the 90s, I guess. The Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie. Tommy's dagger can fly and has its own conscience and has a little face on it, just like the dagger here, a little face on the hilt, and it can fly around and do its wielder's bidding.
The Saba, though, obviously having laser eyes, which gives him the edge.
Saba, that's the name of the dagger.
Yes.
You just know that? Did you look that up? You know the name of Tommy's dagger? Saba.
You got to understand. You got to understand. Power Rangers is a very fundamental thing in my youth.
I mean, me too. I didn't know that dagger had a name, though. Okay.
I used to have it, so of course
Good
I
pull,
know.
Andrew. Good pull.
There's one other cast member I would like to mention, just because I didn't realize this upon watching. But one of the Shadow's network of people, I believe this is the guy who sits at the computers and the panels and sends the messages.
Oh, no computers, Andrew. This is 1930s. It's very much
all the screens. Is it screens, or am I just losing
what is in front? I don't think there's anything like that in front of him.
Yeah, I don't know. But he's sitting at this giant bank
pieces of paper and pens.
Yeah, it's like, but anyway, maybe it's radios, but he's basically the hub of like the Shadow's communications throughout the city. But that's actually an actor named Andre Gregory, who is notable for being the co-writer and co-star of the film My Dinner with Andre. He is the titular Andre in that film, with Wallace Shawn being the other character. And I just was like, wait, what? Like, this is such a weird small thing that I was.
Yeah,
like,
I don't think he has a
shocked.
line in the movie. He just
no, I don't think he does.
These messages.
Yeah,
that's fun.
But yeah, I just thought that was a fun little tidbit.
Well, it's time that we jump into the movie itself and go through some of these scenes, specifically the best scenes in the movie. And again, we're starting at the high point, at the top, at the peak. Andrew, in your opinion, what's the best scene of this movie? When is it firing on all cylinders?
To me, I actually think it's our unveiling of the Shadow. Basically, our first scene kind of in the present of the film, after we flash back to the beginning, where we're on this bridge with Roy Tam being cement blocked by these gangsters. and then the shadow kind of makes his first appearance to us, the audience. And it's just really cool. It's a good action sequence. You get a really good indicator of what the shadow is, obviously how he fights people, what the deal is. And it's just a really, like, as far as unveiling scenes for characters, it works extremely well.
Man, I got the same scene written down as my favorite. It's fantastic. It's a great debut of our hero. As you said, some mobsters have this man in cement shoes, and they're about to throw him over the bridge. And the shadow shows up. We get to see some of his powers. Of course, he looks strange, like we talked about. He got that long nose, but otherwise, a pretty cool costume. Very true to the 30s. He's not wearing spandex because that wasn't a thing when the shadow was created.
Nope.
It's sort of like a long trench coat, a fedora, and then this bandana over the bottom half of his face. And then he's got two guns, like the Phantom. They've always got to have these twin pistols. But at any rate, he shows up. But the first thing we hear is his voice. He's sort of tormenting these bad guys. You kind of hear this cackling, this kind of bouncing around the bridge. And, you see a lot of the stuff. It had to have been an influence on Batman. Batman who is, strikes fear to the hearts of criminals. He's toying with these guys. He's scaring them before he makes himself appear in front of them. And it's pretty rad. I definitely like it. And this set is gorgeous. I mean, it's just, you can tell that they kind of just built on a studio lot, this short section of a bridge. And then you see it's set at night. And in the background, you see the cityscape. And I don't know if it was a matte painting, but it's definitely practical, and it's definitely not actually a city in the distance. So it's definitely just some awesome set design. It looks absolutely gorgeous. It's something that you don't see anymore. And I'm not trying to say like practical is always better or this is better. The way they do things now is also gorgeous, but this just has this feel to it that I definitely miss. I love the look of this movie overall, but this scene in particular, looks wonderful.
Fantastic.
So they got this guy in cement shoes, and I'm watching this and I'm thinking, like, this is it's a concept that everybody's familiar with. Gangsters putting a victim's feet in cement and then throwing them over a bridge, and they brutally drown. But I was kind of curious if this is based on anything in real life, and surprise, it's not. It's not a real thing. It's something that's just sort of been done in detective novels and pulp novels, and of course movies like we see here. However, there actually is one case documented in real life where this was done to individuals pretty recently, 2016. And I pulled this little snippet from the article. It doesn't get too graphic, but quick trigger warning. It kind of describes a dead body. Here's the segment. It says, this is a quote from a detective that was on the case. And they said, this individual was wrapped in plastic bags and his arms were tied behind him and his feet were submerged in concrete. Detective Robert Boyce said in a press conference. And then he adds, obviously a homicide.
I should not laugh at that. But yes.
Just in case you thought this was the most elaborate suicide of all time. No,
apparently not.
Obviously, someone did this to him. But yeah, when you think about the realistically,
I mean, it's not at all practical. It's not at all.
Like concrete takes a long time to harden. Like, how do you keep somebody there?
Even quick setting stuff is like not super tough. Like to actually create like a solid block that's going to keep someone's feet in it and like not break apart. Like, don't they even like at one point, I can't remember, don't they like scratch at the concrete or something? And
yeah,
go like,
the mob boss, like, is it ready? And then he pulls out a switchblade and runs it across the block. He's like, yeah, it's hard. It's like, okay. There's a man like standing in this block, but you've got to run your knife on it to show that it's hard. It's not going.
It's
although
such a
the
weird
shadow
thing.
does break it apart by shooting it with his twin pistols, and that shatters the concrete. Doesn't injure our victim. That's why he's a superhero.
As I say, he's a great shot.
Love the scene. Love that intro. It's great.
Yeah.
Like I said, before that, we kind of see how the shadow becomes the shadow in this little introduction of this movie. We're going to talk about that scene, but the transition from that to this bridge, it's 8 minutes into this movie. There's a bit of an exposition crawl, almost like Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
The text is crawling across the screen, and here's what it says about our hero. The price of redemption for Cranston was to take up man's struggle against evil. The Tolku taught him to cloud men's minds, to fog their vision through force of concentration, leaving visible the only thing he can never hide, his shadow. And I'm reading that because I'm not familiar with this character's powers, and I'm thinking like it's being like metaphorical, like his shadow because he has like a shady past.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's very literal. When
Yeah.
he turns himself invisible, you can still see his shadow.
Yes.
The exposition continues. Thus armed, Cranston returned to his homeland, that most wretched lair of villainy we know as New York City. This is definitely the era where, New York is known as like the crime capital of the world.
Yeah.
So what do you think about these powers, Andrew? I think it's so interesting that this is like the dawn of the superhero, the superpowered vigilante. And it's not like, like super strength is like such a classic power, or something like the ability to fly, or, heat vision even. This is such a like intricate and specific power, the power to cloud men's minds and turn himself invisible. It's hard kind of to define, but it's interesting, I guess, that so early in this genre that we love is this complex superpower.
Well, right. And the original print stuff, the original Shadow doesn't have a lot of these powers, to be fair. Like when that pulp hero starts, it really is. He's no different from the rest of the adventurer types. Like he can fight, he's pretty good with guns, but the Shadow was always the master of like stealth and disguise. That was always kind of the thing. Later, like I said, they take that to a more extreme level with him being able to literally become a Shadow. But originally he's just like a pulp hero. But yeah, it's something but those powers come in pretty soon. They're not like a late stage addition, because if you're being honest, the Shadow stopped being a fairly relevant character by the 50s and the 60s when the superheroes have appeared. But you're right. It's and the idea of like mental clouding abilities, using that instead of like mind control, like something like that, it just made it sound so much cooler, and made it, the ability to cloud men's minds, create shadows, whatever you want to call it. But it's a very unique power set, and it's interesting too to think about, like nowadays, like flight and strength, those are the default, but like at the time, I can't imagine there would have been a default. Like these things weren't common. Like it's
maybe. I mean, strength is. I mean, that's like Hercules. Is like a strong man. Yeah. I mean that goes back, I think, but maybe not so much flight, and maybe not using these powers for like to be a superhero. Stuff, yeah, that's still definitely pretty new. At the beginning of this movie, so like I said in the synopsis, it starts with Alec Baldwin, our hero, in Tibet as a drug lord, and it just kind of throws us in. And my note says Alec Baldwin looking rough. He's got like this long hair, these gross nails. It reminds me, honestly, of Casanova Frankenstein from Mystery Men.
Yes,
he looks just like
does.
that. Which
he's definitely pulling that vibe.
Great movie. Andrew, should we talk about Mystery Men on this podcast?
I absolutely think we should.
Okay, I think it's mostly liked, but it was a bomb in theaters. It failed.
It's not liked enough.
That's true. Possible future episode, but in any case, I'm watching this and I'm like, I know Alec Baldwin's the hero, so I just don't really get it. Like, there's a scene of him like waking up in a bed, like surrounded by beautiful women, and he stands up and he's got like this big hairy chest, and I don't know.
So ridiculous.
I'm supposed to like this character, right? But he looks kind of sleazy, and he is clearly a drug lord. He's like, there's these opiate fields that he's clearly in charge of, and then he gets captured, taken to this temple that appears mysteriously. It's obviously like a mystical place, and he's confronted by, again, the Tolku, who's going to give him these powers. They have a fight first. This is where we see the dagger for the first time flying around, making its Frank Welker noises. And the Tolku wears him down, and he tells him, it doesn't go into it too much, but I'm guessing the Tolku like looks for people that need redeeming, and he's sort of giving them the path. It's almost like a blessing and a curse type thing. Like, I'm going to give you these powers, but you're going to devote your life to helping others. I guess is kind of the way that I read that. What do you think?
I think so. I think that's a good way to look at it. Obviously, this is a bit of a redemption type story. Basically, you're taking a guy that's pretty far gone, seemingly, drugs, dealing them, acquiring them, selling them. But
Drugs bad.
but the Tolku obviously sees something in him, sees that he's capable of starting to kind of make up for potentially what he's done, starting with his hometown. So, like I said, the idea of redemption is there. The idea of like, you've got this potential. Let's capitalize on it.
Yeah. In another parallel with Batman, he returns to New York City as a very rich socialite. His character of Lamont Cranston is very much Bruce Wayne. He's putting on this front until the time comes to be a vigilante.
I think his uncle even jokes like, "What do you do all day?" Like he doesn't even know what he does. Like he's like, he's like, "You're late to dinner. You're the one that asked me here. What is it you're even doing? Like, what are you up to?"
And like you said, other than that little intro where we kind of get how he got his powers, it jumps ahead 7 years, I think.
Yep.
And he has the system in place. He's an experienced vigilante. We're not going through the typical origin of him learning these powers slowly and stuff, which there's a way that can be done where it's interesting. But I also appreciate where it's like, let's just go. Let's just cut to where he's experienced. He's got this system in place. So like we see he saves that man on the bridge in the beginning and he gives him a ring that's like has like a big red light on it, like it signals whenever he needs someone. And there's people you see throughout the movie that have these rings. Some of them it makes it a point to show you, but other one that you'll see a character in the background or a random police officer that has that ring. So he has this intricate network and it's all connected. I love, again, just kind of how tactile this movie is. There's a point where he goes to his lair and it's like this random brick wall in an alleyway that he pushes a brick and it slides open and he runs down these stairs. And you mentioned there's the guy where he receives all the messages from different people, different correspondents that come through these tubes like a drive-through bank. And he opens them up and reads the messages and passes them along. And it's all like physical, tactile thing because of course the time this movie takes place. So even though we got like this supernatural power and stories, there's still a very real thing that you can put a finger on. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree. It feels like there's this big world basically, and that, like I said, that was part of what I thought was really cool about it, was like showing somebody coming into that, showing how that actually functions. Like, how does that information get from that police officer to the shadow? Because this is the 30s, the idea of computers and everything doesn't exist, even though I misspoke earlier. But yeah, all of that's really, really cool. The design is cool. Like I said, it feels like there's this massive network, and that's a cool subtle thing that I like about it too, is like there are people in this movie that wear the rings that don't really do anything. Like you just know that, oh, that guy's with the shadow. Like it just shows that there are these people all around the town that are watching out and doing their part.
Yeah, the secret society. And he tells them there's a pass phrase, I guess you could say. The sun is shining, but the ice is slippery. So if someone tells you that, someone says the sun is shining, you respond with,
the ice is slippery.
And that's how you know you're in the club together.
Well, that means the shadow is going to come calling, apparently. So be ready.
So it's kind of similar to like how the Tulku gave him powers, but he has to fight evil. It's kind of the same. Like he saves someone, but then they owe him a favor in a way.
Right. But a weird, much more intimidating version of Pay It Forward.
Yeah. I love when Lamont Cranston uses his powers of persuasion.
Yes.
So like like you said, like it's funny like hearing someone's dialogue to suddenly shift because their mind is being clouded, but also like visually he'll like sit back in his chair and then the lights dim and there's only light like across his eyes and he's hidden in shadow. It's very dramatic.
So
it's very cool. Very like old Hollywood. They did the same thing in like the Addams Family. Morticia, she's always like only her eyes are lit. Just like a very old school Hollywood thing of lighting. It's very cool.
Yes, that's a cool effect. Yeah, the Dracula effect. But yeah, I like all that kind of stuff where they kind of like are genuinely using like a different visual language for things rather than just having them like sit there and just say it, because you could do that, but it's not particularly visually interesting. So to actually make there be a visual distinction is just a cool little touch.
Going back to like how Alec Baldwin, like his voice is just naturally like that, and it can very easily be played straight or for laughs. I
Mhm.
love the scene where he's at dinner with Margot, who again is telepathic, which is unique to this movie. The character exists in lore, the shadow lore, but typically isn't telepathic. I guess they just wanted a way, like, how could this person be a fun foil for the shadow? Well, if
Right.
she can get in his mind, then they can have that fun back and forth. They're at dinner together, and she motions to her dress. And she's like, "Oh, thanks, I just bought it." And he just goes, "Why did you tell me that?" And she's like, "He complimented my dress." And he's like, "No, he didn't." But he thought it. And
Yeah,
she
it's like I was
sometimes
thinking it.
she has trouble like knowing if someone said something or thought something because she's telepathic. And that's where she's casually like, "Oh, I have these telepathic powers, by the way. It's no big deal." And he's like, "Oh crap." She's gonna figure out that I'm the shadow, but just out of nowhere, like she's like thanking him for a compliment, and he's like, "Why did you tell me
Why?
that?"
I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things I like too is there's this scene where obviously the Shadow and Khan are kind of having their final confrontation. It goes through these some really cool set pieces here. There's one with like a hall of mirrors where they're all fighting around that, where it just looks really, really cool. But then like there's a sequence where he finally like defeats him, and like this giant building just appears on the street for all these people that had no idea it was there. And just the idea of like there being an entire secret building, no less, like how'd you even do that? Like, it's just something that's wild and ridiculous, but also just kind of fits in with the story. The case of the invisible building, like I'd easily see like a pulp story being
Yeah,
called that.
definitely.
Like I said, and just these set pieces here during this final fight, because basically the Shadow and Khan are running after each other while Margot and her father are trying to stop this bomb. We get a fun little callback to his color blindness when he almost cuts the wrong colored wire here.
Yeah.
But then, like I said, that fight between the Shadow and Khan is just really cool. That mirror scene in particular, like they're using all the tricks, kind of making it all go around. Like I said, this movie really doesn't slow down. There's not a whole lot of like breathing. It just goes. But this whole final fight is also pretty cool.
Yeah, the final fight's cool. They fight a few times, and there's one time where they fight. I took a note here. They have guns. They shoot at each other in midair. The bullets collide and fall to the ground, which we've seen a ton in movies, but I'm kind of curious if this might have been the first time, because it's definitely something that you need some kind of visual effects for, whether it's computers or some advanced technology. It's not something they could have
Yeah.
done back in the 30s, 40s, or 50s making movies. So I'm curious how far that trope goes back and how early it was, because something as recent as what did we just
The Suicide Squad.
Yeah, Suicide Squad. The new one has kind of a play on that, two bullets colliding. And I'm curious if this might have been the first one. Be a fun claim to fame for the movie.
It would. I'd be curious if any of the John Woo gun fu movies, as they're called, the ones, The Better Tomorrow, Hard Boiled, The Killer, if any of those might also utilize that, just because they were the ones known for like the slow motion gunplay, things
Right,
like
right.
that. I'm curious, so I might have to do some research here, see if we can find the truth here.
The movie has an interesting sense of humor. It's not like a laugh riot or constant, jokes, but there's definitely
Right.
some quips, some typical superhero stuff. At one point, he's fighting goons and they tumble over the side of a rooftop and then they land on a gargoyle. And so the shadow kind of smashes this goon between the gargoyle and himself. He falls on top of him. And then he tells him, "Next time you get to be on top." Just a very like, is that
Yeah.
cool? Is that a cool thing to tell a goon?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I should be rooting for you right now or not.
And then he's talking again to Margot later once he knows, she's telepathic and everything. And she's talking about how easy it is to read his mind. And he says, "Well, psychically, I'm very well endowed." Like, I don't know what that means.
I love that it's in that same, it might be in that same sequence, but he has this part where he's talking to her and she's talking about this dream she has where she's like lying naked on the beach and like it's very like romantic and erotic and all of that. And he's just like, "I had a dream. I pulled my face off and I was somebody else." And she's like, "You have problems." And he's like, "I'm aware of that."
Yeah, that was great. And we see that dream that he's talking
Yeah,
about
we
where
do.
he pulls the skin off his face, and it's pretty gnarly. Like he's looking in a mirror and he starts to pull at the skin on his face and it starts to like rip off. And it looks great. And what's interesting about this is the camera is like constantly moving during this to really sell you on the effect. It's not like if the camera is stationary, it makes visual effects much easier. But by moving, it's really putting you into the scene, making it feel real and come to life. And he rips all of the skin off of his face, and he's Khan underneath, which was the the nightmare that he's having, where these powers could lead to the quote unquote dark side, if you will, typical superhero stuff.
Right.
And it's a pretty gnarly scene. And then he references it a few seconds later when she describes her erotic dream she has. And yeah, I dreamed I tore the skin off my face.
And I was
Awesome.
somebody else underneath. That dream we all have.
Oh yeah. I also love whenever he tries to use his powers on Margot and they don't work, I guess because of her abilities. Like he can't cloud her mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so after they have dinner, he says, it does like the dramatic lighting and everything. So he knows he's using his powers. And he tells her, "You will forget about me. You will give no further thought." And she goes, "Are you drunk? What the hell are you doing?"
Yeah. Yeah, that was pretty good. Like I said, some pretty good. The movie has a good sense of humor. It's not like overt, but and I wouldn't even necessarily call it like self-aware or anything, but like it augments the action pretty well.
Ramping up to that final fight, the Shadow has a standoff with Tim Curry's character, who almost kills him at one point in the movie by drowning him in this big tank, which is it's pretty fun, like it's set piece. And then they finally have a final fight inside that mystery building that finally gets revealed. And Tim Curry has a Tommy gun, and he's in the middle of this room. The Shadow's doing his thing where he's, bouncing around his voice and stuff and being intimidating. And Tim Curry he goes full Tim Curry here, and he's shooting his Tommy gun randomly, and he starts mocking the Shadow. He's like, "Coward, chicken, sissy, come out here and fight like a man." And then the Shadow finally clouds his mind and tells him that's the exit, pointing to a window. And Tim Curry runs and leaps through a window super dramatically, Tim Curry style. And it's a fun death, I guess you could say.
Yeah, like Tim Curry has never met a script that he couldn't chew up and spit out without any work. But
for sure,
yeah, he's clearly having a good time here. But yeah, he's a bad man. It's not bad that he meets a stylish demise.
that final confrontation with Khan, you touched on it, but when he first meets him, he learns that Khan has killed the Tulku, and then the dagger comes out, and Lamont goes, "Oh, that knife," and it flies at him, and he has a very dramatic fight with a flying dagger. Like
twice. He fights a flying dagger twice in this movie.
Because he fights
that flying dagger has 2 dedicated fight scenes in this movie.
And it's just like you imagine. It's, on set, it's Alec Baldwin holding a knife, acting and pretending like the knife is getting closer to his throat, and there's some forcing it. So kudos to him for pulling our Mark Strong Award winner, pulling that off, selling that
as hard as he possibly can.
But to win, he sort of just takes control of the knife. His psychic powers end up being stronger than Khan's, and the knife is now able to do his bidding, and he turns it on him.
Mm-hmm.
And then that Hall of Mirrors that you mentioned, that's where it's a pretty extended fight for the most part with Khan, but it ends in this Hall of Mirrors. And I love how he handles that, because he drops in, and this is a scene we've seen a lot in movies, a Hall of Mirrors, and you think you see the bad guy and you shoot, and then a mirror shatters. You realize it's just, he bypasses all of that. He just closes his eyes, concentrates really hard, and shatters all of the mirrors at once. And so he can plainly see where Khan is standing. And then he uses his powers to make a shard of glass float up and shoots it right into his forehead. Pretty brutal.
Yeah.
He doesn't kill him, because we see like in the next scene, he's in like a psych ward. They removed the glass, which also removed his psychic powers, and he's forever trapped inside of this psych ward.
It's actually more brutal than that. They removed that, but they actually say they removed part of his brain.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
They actually lobotomized him essentially. But I think they mention earlier in the movie that the powers are part of a specific, like your frontal lobe or something.
Yeah.
So I guess the Shadow knew kind of where the powers resided. And then of course we actually find out that doctor at the hospital is one of the network. So they're keeping this guy under wraps.
It's very similar to Batman Forever. That ends with
Yeah.
the Riddler in a psych ward. Um,
I
trapped
don't
in there.
think they did anything to his brain though.
They didn't
Maybe
need
he
to. He
I
did
say
it to
he did it to
himself.
his own brain. Yeah.
So part of the bad guy's plan was to create essentially an atomic bomb. I think they call it that. He becomes like the person to create the atomic bomb, I think is what they imply.
Well, right, because that name hasn't come up. They haven't. The atomic
Like
bomb
they
doesn't
name
exist
it
yet.
in the movie. Yeah. It reminds
He
me
makes
of
he makes a joke of it or something. Like I think it's Roy Tam's like an atomic bomb, and like that's like a moment of like self awareness
yeah.
of like, oh, that doesn't exist yet.
It reminds me of a joke in Wild Wild West, which is a movie I've seen a ton. I don't ask why. But Kevin Kline's character is named Gordon in that movie, and he's like an adventurer and he has all these gadgets and stuff throughout. And at one point, he invents an airplane, what we know as an airplane, and him and Will Smith's character are flying. And he's like, "This is, pretty cool. What are you gonna call this?" He goes, "Oh, I'm gonna call it a Air Gordon," which is Andrew. There's layers to that joke.
Let's say that's an ogre of jokes there.
You think he's gonna say airplane, but he says Air Gordon after his name, which also sounds like Air Jordan.
Air Jordan.
Look at that.
Whoa.
Just explaining all the layers because jokes are better when they're explained to you.
From director Barry Sonnenfeld, no less.
Anyway, this bomb that he creates. Andrew, did this bomb remind you of anything? Because it's like it's a ball, right? And there's this wacky sequences where they're trying to catch it and it's rolling through the hallway and stuff. Pretty extended sequence where they're chasing after this bomb.
You know what they say. You know what they say sometimes, Chris. Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
Yes, it reminded me simultaneously of two Batman movies. You've got Batman the movie with Adam West, where he famously tries to get rid of this bomb that is just a big metal ball, and then they do it again in the Dark Knight Rises.
I like to think that in Dark Knight Rises they were like, we need to do this exact scene from Batman the movie, but find a way to make it serious, because like it genuinely kind of feels like that sometimes.
It does. There's a great action scene in the movie. First of all, in case we haven't made it clear already, this movie is full of like very cool special effects. They're very 90s. They're very practical. They might look dated, but they look great in a way that you might watch something like The Labyrinth with David Bowie. And you're like, it's puppets and it's outdated technology, but it's still very interesting to watch. I feel the same way about The Shadow. This movie looks awesome.
Oh, yeah.
And one of my favorites is he's fighting, a room full of bad guys, and he has himself disguised. You only see his shadow, and his shadow is on a brick wall. And this bad guy throws daggers at his shoulders, the shoulders of the shadow. And then the shadow comes out of the shadow. I'm realizing how hard this is to describe, but he emerges from the shadow in the wall. And as he emerges at his shoulders, the knives stay inside of him and they pin him to the wall. And it's another scene where like the camera's moving and they're really selling the special effect. I don't know how they did it, but it looks very good.
I just do want to note that this movie is actually shot by Stephen H. Burham, who actually also shot Mystery Men. And if you told me that the same guy shot both movies, I would absolutely believe you.
Yeah. I mean, the city is Mystery Men. The city in that movie looks as good as Gotham ever does, like in the 90s franchise.
That guy also shot The Untouchables, the film in 87 by Brian De Palma. And again, like aesthetically lining up, like it all lines up. This guy really knows how to capture that feel and that vibe very well.
Awesome. Yeah, totally. I buy it. This movie looks great. I mean, I don't 35% on Rotten Tomatoes. That kind of baffles me a bit. I mean, it's not a perfect movie. I understand how it wasn't a huge blockbuster, but at the very least, baseline, like visually, it is a treat for the eye, bubblegum for the eyes, as Roger Ebert would say.
I think this is generally like I would expect something more in the 40s or even the 50s, kind of like this feels like a fairly competent film, and that's not meant as like a backhanded thing either. Like it's not a movie that like outwardly I'm like, oh yeah, I get why this was not enjoyed. I think this movie's like hitting the right notes. Is it, like I said, is it the greatest thing of all time? No, but I think the goal the movie has, it accomplishes pretty well.
100%. So, Andrew, in your estimation, does this movie succeed as an adaptation of the character, the Shadow?
I think more yes than no. I think, again, this is another instance where we're kind of taking a lot of different pieces and trying to put them all together into kind of like a streamlined approach, as we've talked about before. I think David Koepp has spoken about being a fan of the Shadow. So I think he's coming into this with respect for the character, respect for the history, respect for the legacy. And I think by and large, as an adaptation, it's mostly succeeding. Like I said, it's taking a lot of different pieces, putting them together in one place. But I don't, if you asked me how to do a Shadow movie differently, I don't really know what different approach I would take. I think this is really coming at you with the best possible version of the Shadow that you could get for the most part. I mean, sure, you could maybe get one that's got a tighter plot or maybe something like that. But like, I think by and large, David Koepp is especially coming from a respectful place. And I think overall, if you watch this movie, I'm never going to be like, no, that's not the Shadow. Like this is what the Shadow does. This is how the character is. And I think by and large, it's a respectful adaptation.
Well, look, I think that does it for us this week. That's The Shadow. There is a ton to like. It's on HBO Max. That's where I watched it. So if you get a chance and you want to check it out, I would definitely recommend it.
I agree. I think there's stuff to enjoy here. Like I said, there's a good visual language. The movie looks great. The cast all has a really good chemistry with each other. I think there's a lot of fun to be had here.
Like we mentioned at the top of the episode, if there is a comic book movie that you like that was poorly received upon release, we want to know about it. Send us an email, bestoftherestpod@gmail.com, or hop into our Discord. There's an invite in the episode description. Something else you can do for us, if you would be so kind, leave us a review on Apple Podcast. It helps us tremendously. It does great things for helping us get discovered by new people. It helps with the algorithms in Apple Podcasts. And we just like hearing your nice words. And of course, we are going to read those words on an episode, every single review that we get. We have a lot of stuff planned in the future.
Yep.
You can always check the episode description to see what movie is coming up next week. And again, to plug that Discord, if you want to find out movies coming up more than a week out, jump in there. We'll talk about them. You can watch movies ahead of time or watch movies with us. Even there's a lot of fun stuff happening in there. Andrew, I was recently a guest on another podcast. Are you aware of this? Have you heard about this? Sorry.
How dare you?
No, I was.
And I find out like this in this venue.
I did it in a public,
in our own home,
so you wouldn't make a scene, Andrew. I was very flattered to be invited to be a guest on Gotta Rank 'Em All, which is a show about ranking every single Pokemon, 20 Pokemon at a time. So every episode they bring on a guest. You talk 20 various Pokemon that are randomly chosen, and you get to put them on a master list of Pokemon. Each guest gets to bring the Pokemon of their choice. I brought my boy Charmander with me and got to talk about how much I love that cute little guy and get him ranked on their list. And it's a super fun conversation, super fun show. Again, I'm going to cram this episode description full of links. Go check it out down there. It's on YouTube as well as in your favorite podcast app. The podcast is called The Spelunkers. Again, the show in that podcast is called Gotta Rank 'Em All. So come listen to me talk about Pokemon. Are you a big Pokemon fan, Andrew?
I remember the original Rage. I was around for that when it became like a thing. I like tacitly remember like the Pokemon phenomenon happening.
Sure, yeah.
So I was there right at the beginning. So I played Blue and Red until my thumbs wore out and then kind of lost track of it. Bought a couple of different versions and always intended to play them, but never really got into it. But did come back for Sword Shield when it was finally like on the Switch and I could finally play it on a screen.
Yeah.
I'm old and handheld is tough. But yeah, so who knows? Maybe I'll show up on that podcast one day.
Oh, maybe. Stay tuned. And until then, remember, maybe not every movie is great,
but all movies have greatness.
Thank you to Mark Benavides for singing our theme song. Follow him on Instagram at NotThatMarkAnthony. Thank you to Mitch of Depressed to Impress for the music. Check them out on YouTube and twitch.tv. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. It's the only way we're going to grow. And follow us on social media at BOTRcast. Thank you. The Shadow was directed by Russell. Fuck, I looked this up last time. Mulcahy.
Okay. Yeah.
The Shadow is directed by Russell The Shadow is directed by Russell Mulcahy. Oh my God. Mulcahy.
Mulcahy. You got it.
Red Bull's backfiring on me. The Shadow, Margot, and a network of allies must work together to stop the evil Khan. Khan. In case that didn't work. In case it's too loud. I'll pick which one sounds better.